spent one full fire season working as a lookout, stationed alone in a tower deep in a national forest. The kind of job that sounds peaceful right up until you're actually living it, weeks at a time, with almost no human contact beyond scheduled radio check-ins with the district office. My job was simple in theory. Watch the horizon for smoke, log weather conditions, report anything unusual. In practice, it meant a lot of silence, a lot of time alone with my own thoughts, and, as it turned out, one specific stretch of nights I still can't fully explain. The tower itself sat on a ridge with a clear view for miles in every direction, accessible by a single trail that took most of a day to hike, meaning visitors were essentially non-existent outside of the occasional supply drop. I'd been out there about 6 weeks when the first strange thing happened, small enough that I initially wrote it off as exhaustion or the general disorientation that comes from too much isolation. Our district ran scheduled radio check-ins twice a day, morning and evening, a simple routine where I'd confirm conditions and report anything of note. One evening, right around my scheduled check-in time, I picked up the radio and heard, faintly, underneath the usual static, what sounded like another lookout doing their own check-in on the same frequency. A voice reporting conditions from a station I didn't recognize, using a call sign that didn't match any of the towers in our district that I was aware of. I mentioned it to my supervisor during my own check-in that same evening, thinking maybe it was crosstalk from a neighboring district's frequency bleeding through, which happens occasionally depending on atmospheric conditions. She told me, a little too quickly for my comfort, that there was no other lookout on that frequency, that our district didn't have any station using the call sign I'd described, and to let her know if it happened again. It happened again 3 nights later, same time, same static-laced voice giving a station report, and this time I caught more of what was actually being said. The voice was reporting smoke, a specific bearing and distance, calm and professional in tone, exactly like a real check-in, except when I looked in that exact direction from my own tower, there was nothing there. Clear visibility all the way to the horizon, no smoke anywhere near where this phantom station claimed to be seeing it. I started keeping a log of these transmissions, mostly out of a need to have some kind of documentation in case anyone doubted me later. And the pattern held for the rest of that week, always around my check-in time, always reporting conditions that never matched what I could actually observe from my own position. On the 5th occurrence, the voice, for the first time, said something that wasn't a standard station report at all. It said my own tower's call sign, clearly, deliberately, followed by a long stretch of silence before the transmission cut off entirely. I didn't sleep well after that. The following night, doing my normal evening routine before bed, I noticed movement far below the tower, at the edge of the tree line surrounding the small clearing my tower sat in. A figure, distant enough that I couldn't make out any real detail, even with binoculars, standing at the tree line, facing directly up at the tower, completely still. I radioed it in immediately, and my supervisor, understandably, told me it was likely a hiker who'd wandered off the main trail, nothing necessarily alarming on its own, and to keep an eye on it but not to worry unless it approached closer. I watched that figure for close to 20 minutes through my binoculars, and it never moved, even slightly. No shifting weight, no adjustment of stance, nothing consistent with a person simply standing and resting during a hike. When I finally looked away to grab a flashlight for a better look as it got darker, and looked back within seconds, it was gone, with no visible movement in any direction across open enough terrain that I should have been able to track it leaving. This continued for the better part of 2 weeks. The phantom radio check-ins, always around my own scheduled time, sometimes reporting smoke where there was none, sometimes simply silent static that felt, in a way I struggled to explain to my supervisor without sounding unstable, deliberately attentive, like someone was listening rather than transmitting. The figure at the tree line, appearing intermittently, always at dusk, always at that same distance, always gone the moment I looked away and back. I requested an early relief from that posting, citing general burnout, which is common enough in this line of work that no one questioned it too closely. My replacement arrived about 4 days after my request went through, and I want to describe the handoff conversation, briefly, because of something he said that I've never been able to shake. I gave him the standard rundown of the tower systems, the radio schedule, general procedures, and near the end, somewhat reluctantly, I mentioned what I'd been experiencing, expecting him to either dismiss it or think less of me for bringing it up at all. Instead, he went quiet for a moment and told me that this particular tower had a reputation within the district that wasn't widely discussed. something he'd only heard about from an older ranger during his own training, involving a lookout decades earlier who disappeared from this exact post under circumstances that had never been fully resolved. No body ever recovered, despite an extensive search. The tower itself found unlocked and undisturbed, no sign of struggle, simply empty. I asked him if he was worried, hearing all that, about taking the post himself. He said he needed the hours toward his certification and didn't have much choice in the matter, but that he intended to keep a much closer log of his radio traffic than standard protocol required, just in case. I never found out whether he experienced anything similar during his own posting there. I didn't reach out to ask, and he never reached out to tell me, which I've chosen to interpret, for my own peace of mind, as meaning nothing further happened. I haven't taken another lookout posting since, and I still find myself, on quiet evenings at home, checking my phone at the exact time my old check-ins used to happen, half expecting, even now, to hear that same static-laced voice reporting smoke from somewhere that was never actually burning at all. Now moving to next story. I worked for a couple of years as a field technician on a wildlife research project studying owl populations across a large stretch of protected forest, which mostly involved setting up audio recording equipment at fixed points throughout the study area and collecting the data periodically to analyze call patterns and territory ranges. It's quiet, methodical work, mostly done alone, hiking out to remote recording stations, swapping storage cards, checking equipment, hiking back. I want to walk through one specific station and one specific stretch of recordings, because it's the reason I eventually left that field entirely. The recorders themselves were simple devices, continuous audio capture triggered by any sound above a certain volume threshold, running on solar power with enough storage to hold weeks of data before I needed to service them. Station 14, the one I want to describe, sat in a particularly dense, old-growth section of the forest, harder to access than most of our other sites, which is partly why it took me longer than usual to notice a pattern in its recordings compared to the others. The first thing that stood out, going through data from that station during a routine review, was a level of human vocalization far beyond what any other station in our study picked up, despite Station 14 actually being the most remote and least likely to have any human foot traffic near it at all. I initially assumed it was some kind of equipment malfunction, cross-contamination from a nearby hiking trail, or possibly hunters passing through, none of which made sense given how far off any marked trail that station actually sat. I isolated the human vocal segments and listened to a sample of them, expecting hikers talking, maybe a hunting party, something mundane. What I actually heard was a single voice, always the same voice as far as I could tell across multiple different recording sessions spread over several weeks, speaking too quietly and too indistinctly to make out actual words, always recorded during the deep overnight hours when no legitimate hiker or hunter should have had any reasonable reason to be that far into dense forest terrain. I brought this to my project supervisor, who reviewed the recordings herself and agreed it was strange enough to warrant a closer look, suggesting we should check the physical site itself for any sign of unauthorized camping or trespassing that might explain a consistent human presence out there. We hiked out together the following week to physically inspect the station and the surrounding area. We found nothing. No campsite, no fire ring, no trash, no trail markings suggesting anyone had been regularly accessing that specific location, which, given the density of the surrounding forest and lack of any real path, would have been almost impossible to do repeatedly without leaving some visible sign over the weeks the recordings covered. We checked the recorder itself thoroughly, confirmed it was functioning normally with no evidence of tampering, and reset it before heading back, agreeing to monitor the situation closely over the following weeks. The voice continued appearing in the recordings, if anything with more frequency after our visit rather than less, which struck both of us as strange, since any actual person camping out there would presumably have been more cautious after realizing rangers had come through the area. What genuinely unsettled me, going through the next batch of data, was a segment where the recorder had picked up not just the voice, but what sounded distinctly like someone repeating, quietly, several times in a row, the exact model number and serial designation of our recording equipment. Information that was printed on a small plate on the device itself, but wasn't something any random person passing through would have any reason to know or repeat aloud, let alone find and read in near total darkness deep in dense forest. I stopped being able to explain this as a mundane trespasser after that. I brought the specific recording to my supervisor immediately, and I remember her reaction clearly, because she went quiet for a long time after listening to it, replaying that segment several times before finally saying she thought we should pull the equipment from that station entirely and discontinue data collection there, citing safety concerns to the rest of the research team without going into the specifics of why. We retrieved the recorder for the final time about a week later, and I want to describe that final hike out because it's the part I've never been able to fully process. Approaching the station, well before we could see the actual device, we both heard, faintly, coming from the direction of the recorder itself, that same voice, live, in real time, not a recording, still too quiet to make out clear words, but unmistakably active and present as we approached. We stopped walking. My supervisor, an experienced field researcher who I'd never once seen rattled by anything in the 2 years I'd worked under her, grabbed my arm and told me, very quietly, that we were leaving immediately without retrieving the equipment at all. We left that recorder in place, hiked out faster than I've ever moved through that terrain before or since, and reported the equipment as lost rather than attempt a second retrieval trip. The station was permanently discontinued from our study, marked in our official records simply as inaccessible due to terrain difficulty, which technically wasn't a lie, though it left out the actual reason neither of us was willing to go back. I left that job about 6 months later, for reasons I told colleagues were about wanting a change of pace. Though the truth is, I've never fully been able to hike alone in dense forest since without that specific memory surfacing, the sound of a voice, live and present, waiting near a piece of equipment 11 miles from the nearest trail, reciting a serial number it had no reasonable way of ever having. Scene.now, moving to our next story. I worked as a land surveyor for a firm that handled a lot of boundary work for timber companies and private landowners, which meant plenty of time spent alone or in small crews deep in forested land that rarely saw any other human presence, marking property lines, flagging boundaries, taking GPS readings to confirm official records against the actual terrain. Most of it is tedious, technical work. This particular job, surveying a large parcel of forested land ahead of a planned timber sale, is the only project in my career that I still think about regularly, years later. The parcel itself had unclear boundary records, part of why the company had hired us, an older survey from decades earlier that didn't fully match current GPS data, requiring us to physically walk and reflag the entire perimeter to resolve the discrepancy before the sale could move forward. It was slow work, myself and one other surveyor, cutting through dense underbrush in sections that clearly hadn't seen much human foot traffic in a long time. The first strange thing we encountered was on our third day out there, coming across a section of boundary marked with old metal tags nailed into trees, standard practice for marking a property line decades ago. Except the markings on these particular tags didn't match any surveying convention either of us had ever seen, in years of combined experience doing this work across multiple states. Instead of the standard numbers or letters used to designate boundary points, these tags had a repeating symbol, simple, geometric, carved rather than stamped, appearing on tree after tree along a stretch of boundary that ran for what turned out to be nearly half a mile. We couldn't find any record of these markings in the property's official survey history. Nothing in the county archives when we checked later. No indication of who had placed them or when, though the metal itself, based on the level of corrosion and how deeply the trees had grown around some of the nails, suggested they'd been there for a significant amount of time, likely predating even the older survey record we'd originally been given to work from. We flagged the actual boundary according to our GPS data and continued the job, treating the strange markings as an interesting but ultimately irrelevant historical curiosity, the kind of thing that turns up occasionally on older parcels with complicated ownership histories. It was that evening, back at our camp set up within the parcel itself since the job required multiple days of work too far from any town to commute daily, that things started to feel different. We'd set up in a small clearing a reasonable distance from where we'd been working that day. Standard practice, nothing about the site itself seeming unusual when we chose it that morning. Sometime after dark, my crew partner, an experienced surveyor who'd done this kind of remote field work for over a decade without incident, woke me up, saying he'd heard something moving around our tents, deliberate footsteps circling the campsite slowly, pausing periodically as if listening. We both stayed up, flashlights ready, and heard it clearly ourselves over the following 20 minutes, footsteps moving in a slow, complete circle around our camp perimeter, never approaching directly, staying just beyond the range our flashlights could effectively illuminate into the surrounding brush. Neither of us saw anything directly, just heard the movement, consistent and deliberate, for far longer than any animal would typically circle an occupied campsite. It stopped eventually, and we didn't sleep much for the rest of that night. The following morning, checking the perimeter of our camp in daylight, we found something that neither of us could explain. Small piles of stones, stacked deliberately, 3 or 4 stones high, positioned at regular intervals in a rough circle around our tents, matching almost exactly the path we'd heard the footsteps taking the night before. Neither of us had built these. We were the only 2 people on that entire parcel, miles from any other human presence. We finished the job over the following 2 days, deliberately choosing a different campsite each night, closer to the parcel's access road, and didn't experience anything further, though neither of us fully relaxed for the remainder of that trip. When we got back and I had a chance to do some digging into the property's older history out of my own curiosity, I found a brief mention in an old regional historical archive of the land having been used, generations earlier, by a small, somewhat secretive religious community that had eventually disbanded and scattered, with records of their specific practices being sparse and largely lost to time, beyond a general note that they were known locally for marking boundaries around anything they considered sacred ground. I don't know if that history connects at all to what we experienced. The strange symbol tags, the circling footsteps, the stone piles arranged with clear, deliberate intent around our tents. I've never been able to find anything more specific about that community or what those markings might have actually meant to them. I finished the survey job, the timber sale proceeded as planned, and I've since made a quiet personal habit of asking, before accepting any remote survey job, whether the parcel has any documented history of prior religious or communal use. A question that occasionally gets me strange looks from clients, but one I've never been willing to skip, asking again. Now moving to our next story. I worked as a night watchman for a logging operation for about 1 season, guarding equipment and the active harvest site overnight in a fairly remote stretch of forest, mostly to deter theft of fuel and equipment, which is a bigger problem in that industry than most people realize. It's simple work in theory. Stay awake, do periodic walks of the equipment yard and the active cutting area, radio in if anything seems wrong. I want to describe the specific stretch of nights that made me quit that job with no notice at all, forfeiting my final week's pay rather than go back out there one more time. The site itself was a working harvest area, several dozen acres actively being cleared on a rotating schedule, heavy equipment parked in a staging area overnight, chainsaws and smaller tools locked in a secure trailer. My job was mostly stationary, based out of a small guard shack near the equipment yard, with scheduled walks of the perimeter every couple hours through the night. About 3 weeks into the job, on a walk through the active cutting section, an area where trees had been marked for removal but not yet cut, I heard something that stopped me completely. The distinct sound of a chainsaw running somewhere out in the marked section, followed by the unmistakable sound of a large tree falling, cracking and crashing through the surrounding canopy exactly the way you'd expect from an active harvest operation, except it was well past midnight. No crew was scheduled, and I was, as far as I knew, the only person on site. I radioed the site supervisor immediately, who confirmed no crew had any reason to be out there at that hour and told me to stay near the guard shack rather than investigate alone, that he'd send someone out to check in the morning. I stayed put, genuinely unnerved, and heard it 2 more times before dawn. The same pattern, a chainsaw starting up somewhere in the marked section, running for a stretch consistent with actually felling a tree, followed by the crash of something large coming down. In the morning, when the day crew arrived and we walked the marked section together, every single tree that had been flagged for removal the day before was still standing, completely untouched. No fresh cuts, no fallen trees anywhere. Nothing consistent with what I'd heard multiple times throughout the night. The supervisor, to his credit, took it seriously rather than dismissing it outright, and told me, somewhat reluctantly, that this wasn't actually the first time a night watchman on this specific site had reported something similar, though he'd never personally experienced it himself, and had always assumed previous reports were exaggerated or misattributed to distant legitimate logging activity from a neighboring operation. I want to be clear that there was no neighboring operation active at that hour, and the sound had been close enough, clear enough, that there was no reasonable way to mistake it for something happening miles away. It continued happening over the following 2 weeks, not every night, but often enough that I started keeping a log, same pattern every time, chainsaw, then a fall, always from within the marked section, always with zero physical evidence of any actual tree having come down by the time morning arrived. The night that made me quit happened almost exactly a month into the job. I was on my scheduled perimeter walk, timed to bring me closer to the marked section than usual, specifically because I'd decided, against my better judgment, that I wanted to actually see what was happening, rather than just hear it from a distance. I heard the chainsaw start up, closer than it had ever sounded before, and I made the mistake of actually walking toward it instead of retreating to the guard shack like protocol and common sense both told me to. I got close enough to see, in my flashlight beam, one of the marked trees actively swaying, the way a tree does under a chainsaw's cut right before it starts to fall, despite no chainsaw being visible anywhere near its base, no equipment, no person, nothing physically present that could account for the tree's movement or the sound continuing to come from that exact location. I watched it lean, slowly, exactly the way a real felled tree does, and then, instead of crashing down the way I'd heard so many times before from a distance, it simply stopped, mid-fall, hanging at an angle no real tree could physically sustain without either falling completely or splitting at the base, held there, motionless, for several long seconds before snapping back upright into its original position as if the entire thing had simply reversed itself. I didn't wait to see anything further. I ran back to the guard shack, called my supervisor immediately despite the hour, told him I was leaving and wasn't coming back, and drove off the site before the sun came up, leaving behind gear and a final paycheck I never bothered collecting. I found out later, through a mutual contact still working in that industry, that the company eventually abandoned harvesting that specific section of the parcel entirely, redirecting their operation to a different area of the same property without any official explanation given to the crew about why. I've never gone back into forestry work of any kind since, and I still, on the rare occasions I find myself walking through dense timber for any reason, listen a little too closely whenever I hear anything that sounds even remotely like a chainsaw in the distance, half expecting, every single time, to hear that fall that never quite finishes coming down.